So I've created a new project called Timelapse. I saved it in my Timelapse folder, and I'm now at the sequence settings. On the sequence settings, since I used Photoshop to crop down each image to 1920 by 1080, I'm going to choose um, the digital SLR 1080p 30 frames per second. Now we can adjust the frame rate and still have it play out at 30 frames per second. That'll be part of the experimenting with our time lapse that we do. So I'm calling the sequence time lapse. We'll hit OK here. And in the project window, we need to right click to import. And this is the important part. When you get to your time-lapse photos, you're going to click on a single photo, the first photo in your image sequence. And they should all be named in sequence. Hopefully you shot them back to back and the sequence isn't broken or renumbering from a different point. But the image sequence should be here. And I'm going to click down here on this button that says image sequence. Once I click that, it's going to recognize that I'm trying to import an image sequence. I hit import, and it does say JPEG over here, but you'll notice that the icon resembles a movie clip. If I drag this over to my timeline, you can see that it actually has time, and if I hit play, you can see my image sequence playing. And you'll see some of the anomalies that I got when I recorded it. And we can talk about that a little bit later. For now, I want to talk about the rest of what I want you to do with this. So this particular clip is playing at 30 frames per second. I recorded roughly 200 photos. So if we divide that by 30 frames per second, you're getting roughly 6.5 seconds. So if I zoom in on my timeline here, we can see that I'm just a little over 6.5 seconds. So mathematically that all worked out. But what I want to do now is I'm going to take this and drag it again. And this time I'm going to adjust the speed and duration. I'm going to cut the speed in half. I'm going to set it to 50%. So at 50% it should play twice as long, so that should be an additional 13 seconds. So 13 plus my 6.5 gives me roughly 19 or 20 seconds. So I can see how quickly it plays in the beginning here, and then I get the slower version here. The clouds still look very smooth in the background because they are moving quite slowly. It's the palm trees in the foreground that are being blown constantly by the wind that look choppy. There's a couple other things that look choppy about the clip. So if you watch my clip, we'll go full screen here. If we look at this full screen and animate it, you'll notice it looks like it's on a projector or something. The flashing of color that you see could be a number of different things. Part of it could be my adjustments that I made in Photoshop. So when I batch processed everything and had the computer handle the rest of the processing, it could be that it's processing each image differently. You might see some flashes in the sky over here where the processing made the white come out. I think the main reason that I'm getting the flashing of color and the differences in exposure is that this image sequence was shot on my iPhone. So I taped it to a tripod and put it on standard photo setting. I didn't use the time-lapse mode on my iPhone, and I snapped a photo every 10 seconds. I set a timer on another phone, and every 10 seconds I took a shot. And I did that for about 25 minutes. So a photo every 10 seconds for 25 minutes gave me roughly 200 photos. Now, because this is shot on my iPhone, I have auto exposure on. And if you watch, the exposure settings are going to change a little bit here. So see how it's darker here, and then it gets lighter, and then it's going to go back to dark, and it gets light there, and it goes back to dark. So that flashing that you see is a result of the exposure changing on my iPhone. This is why I would suggest on your real time lapses, not your practice time lapses, shouldn't matter for that, but on your real time lapses, I suggest using a manual exposure so that your exposure is not constantly changing. It's going to keep the effect smooth through the entire, or it's going to keep the exposure the same throughout the entire sequence. The other thing that I'm going to suggest is for any fast moving objects such as the palm trees. Those look very frenetic and aren't very interesting. They don't look like they flow like everything else. The clouds flow smoothly because they move slow. Anything that's moving fast, you're going to want to blur. That's where I suggest using a slower shutter speed, which is again what hurt me in using my iPhone. My iPhone doesn't have the slow shutter speed effect. So I couldn't blur these the way that I would normally blur using my regular camera. The other thing that's jittery about the shot, besides the exposure shifting all the time and the effects of my filters, this is the way I wanted the images to look all the time, but when I ran it through batch processing, you can see that golden glow on that tree disappears pretty quick, and all of a sudden I've got nothing. So the batch processing didn't help. Also, it's a little bit of the fading light, but the golden glow is still there. So part of it's the batch processing, didn't treat it the same. And the other thing that you may see is that there's some image noise in here. That's again having to do with my iPhone shooting and not my not shooting with a nice camera, a good camera. So that should take care of my image sequence. You guys are going to create one at normal frame rate. I want to see 30 frames per second on this one. Then I want you to add it to your timeline again and animate it at 50% frame rate. And then we're going to add it one more time. And I'm going to have you speed it up. And this time I'm going to double the speed, so 200%. So that should be down to 3 seconds for that one. So now I have 3 versions of my image sequence, a normal speed one, a 50% speed one, and a 200% speed one. That should be it. Go ahead and render this out. Please don't forget to use the H.264 codec. Keep it at 1080p and 29 frames per second. And make sure to save it to your final images on the desktop.